Hi everyone. For this lesson we'll take a look at conditional statements. A conditional is basically an if-then statement, and normally we write it as P, the arrow pointing towards Q. Okay, so the P component is called the hypothesis and the Q is the conclusion. So this can be read P implies Q, which means that if P, then you have Q. Alright, so let's take a look at this statement. It says adjacent angles share a vertex. So now we can identify which part of the statement is the hypothesis. So if we look at the first part here, adjacent angles, that will be the hypothesis. Then the conclusion is share a vertex. So from that information we can actually write a conditional, right? So the conditional statement is written like this. If two angles are adjacent angles, then they share a vertex. Alright, here's the original conditional statement. If two angles are adjacent angles, then they share a vertex. Now if we were to switch Q and P and write it as Q implies P this way, then we're essentially writing out the converse. Okay? So by exchanging the hypothesis and the conclusion, we can write out the converse, which is this here. If two angles share a vertex, then they are adjacent angles. So this is the converse. Alright, so the next step is to learn how to negate a statement. So your question might be, how do you negate a statement? Well, think of a statement P. All you have to do is put this symbol in front of it. Okay, so this implies that it's not P. So essentially you're negating the statement P. So let's say you have this statement here, statement P, and the statement P says that it's a blue pen. So if you were to negate this, then this statement will change to it's not a blue pen. So if you start off with the conditional if P then Q, then if you were to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion, then you will end up with what's called the inverse. And the inverse can be written out as if not P, then not Q. Alright, so now instead of starting with the conditional, let's say you start out with the converse. So you have Q implies P. Now if you were to negate the Q and negate the P as well, then you'll end up what's called the contrapositive. And the contrapositive can be written out as if not Q, then not P. Alright, so let's wrap it up by looking at this statement here. We have Mr. Bond teaches at Revere High School. So if we were to write out a conditional statement, it will look like this. We need the if and then. So if that teacher is Mr. Bond, then he teaches at Revere High School. So this is the hypothesis and this is the conclusion. So this would be a conditional. Okay? Now if you were to switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, you'll end up with the converse. So the converse will look like this. If a teacher teaches at Revere High School, then that teacher is Mr. Bond. So you notice that the hypothesis and the conclusion are switched. Therefore, this is called the converse. Okay? Alright, so now let's think of the other two that we have to write out, which are the inverse and the contrapositive. So I'll leave it up to you to come up with these two statements. And I'll give you a hint. You're going to have to use the property of negation in order to come up with the inverse and the contrapositive. And we're done. And we're happy.